This podcast is brought to you by Big Motoring World, one of the UK's biggest used car supermarkets. Welcome to Legends of News, the podcast that talks to the journalists who've had a front row seat at the making of history over the last half a century, and for some of them more. We'll be hearing from the people who are on the spot when the most extraordinary and significant events unfolded right in front of them, who interviewed the good, the great and the not so great, and who spent thousands of hours keeping us informed on our televisions and radios. Many of them are colleagues and rivals, sometimes both, during my own 40-odd years in broadcast news. My guest today genuinely has more strings to her bow than we're going to have time for today, but we're going to have a go. From the 10 o'clock news to the Face of Five, from Strictly to working alongside Sacha Baron Cohen. So much to discuss. She now spends loads of time in darkened rooms watching sometimes inappropriate content. What? I hear you say. All will be explained. We have none other than Natasha Kaplinsky OBE with me now. Welcome, Natasha.
Well, to be promoted to a legend is really quite something.
Does that beat the OBE?
I don't know. No, I mean, the legend thing is, you're the legend, Dermot. I'm very pleased to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I was thinking, the last time you and I sat together in a studio, and this is a studio, was 20-odd years ago when we shared the BBC breakfast sofa together. Halcyon days. We've got so much to discuss about that. But first of all, I think we better unpack some of that introduction, and particularly let's explain to people the darkened room and inappropriate content.
Yes.
That's a roundabout way of saying.
Yes, so I am president. I'm very lucky. I mean, it's one of the many things that I do at the moment, but one of the huge joys is president of the British Board of Film Classification. So I have the huge joy of signing off on every film in the UK. So when you see that big black card in front of every film, that's got my signature on it. But it's part of a wonderful organisation with lots of classifiers who really do sit in a darkened room and watch a lot of films, some of it inappropriate and some, inappropriate. The whole point of
that's the job,
is to protect children and to make sure that people have very good viewing experiences, but that they don't expose children inadvertently to things that they shouldn't watch. But my first day, you're very right, once I'd kind of got the job, which was, lots and lots of interviews. I love film, but it was quite a big job to get for me. I had to watch myself into the role, and there I am in this great big room with a whole load of strangers watching a lot of porn, which was really strange because you have to see the boundaries of where 15, 18 and when something's unclassified. And it's quite a strange experience. Am I supposed to say that I've seen something like this before or not? But yeah, we have some interesting conversations around that boardroom table.
Good God, what about about bits of the body that are or are not appropriate?
Things that we've seen or we shouldn't have seen, and how much of one thing you can see versus another. So I won't embarrass myself or you by unpacking that right now. But yes, there is a lot of uncomfortable viewing. I guess that's
okay. Well, that's where we are now, and we'll get to that. I mean, I try and do these a little bit sequentially, but not always. But just tell us a bit about the background. Because I think, a lot of people don't realise about you. I mean, you've got a lot of African connections, both in the family and indeed where you were brought up.
That's right. So although I was born in the UK, both my parents are South African. My father was a political refugee from South Africa. He was very involved in the apartheid movement and was able to get asylum in the UK from the British government around the whole Mandela days.
Did he more or less get kicked out?
He did. He had 12 hours to leave the country.
He would have gone to jail, basically.
A lot of his friends were assassinated, and so he had 12 hours to leave the country. Otherwise, his name had been found on a list, so he was the next one. And he's hugely ambivalent about whether or not he should have left, but, I'm so glad he did, because, one, I might not have been here, but also he may have been, the next one to have been assassinated by a very unpleasant government at the time. So they missed Africa so much once I was born in the the UK that we ended up emigrating to Kenya. So I spoke Swahili until I was 8. My brother was born in a very rural village just outside of Nairobi and had an incredibly happy upbringing in Kenya. But then we moved back to the UK for, the education of, our education essentially, but that African sense, the love of Africa and that sense of privilege and responsibility where you understand, just the fortune of where you're born and what that gives you in terms of your life chances has stayed with me always. So I've always worked for lots of charities.
I know you get back a lot as well.
I do, and I absolutely love it. Everybody says, when Africa's in your blood, you can't get rid of it. But I just absolutely love being in Africa. And every time I hear a South African accent on the tube or anywhere, it's just, oh my gosh, that's family. That must be family. But yes, so there is a lot of African in us.
So on that, I'm wondering about the roots of your interest, your passion for news. I mean, it's often said that, the environment in which you were brought up does make a difference. And given what was going on, given what your parents were telling you, even at a young age about what was going on politically in South Africa, you kind of get a step ahead, perhaps, maybe of the population here in the United Kingdom. I mean, I myself grew up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and you just absorbed it. You didn't know you were paying attention, but you were to politics because, quite frankly, it made a difference to your personal life. Was that it with you in a very different way?
It absolutely was. I mean, a highly politicised environment. There were lots of really deep, quite intense conversations going on at all times. My mother is a psychotherapist as well, so there was, that element of it as well. But, dinner times at our house were never relaxed. There was always like big conversations to be part of. But again, I remember coming back to the Africa story. I remember coming back to the UK or arriving back in England. We'd obviously never, didn't have a television in Kenya or anything like that. And I remember the first day I saw snow, which was just absolutely magical, but also this box, this magical television box. And that for me was just the gateway. And that's when I realized, I think probably when I was about 9, when I thought, oh my gosh, this was just a magical experience watching television. Not that I sat and watched television for hours on end, but for me, it just was so exciting, having never seen a television and then suddenly seeing what a television could do to take you to these places. And then, as you said, the environment growing up with an academic and a psychotherapist, there was a lot to discuss. And so, yes, I think you're right. News, politicised.
Well, I mean, you're 9 years old. What are you watching on the television? Presumably it's not news, it's Scooby-Doo or something,
it was,
isn't it?
Newsround and things like that, and Grange Hill. And
great.
So I think, those were the formative years. I really think they were.
So how'd you get into it then? I mean, there's, and I've said to other guests, there's the wanting and the doing, the achieving. It's a difficult path. How did you do it?
It certainly was. So I went to Oxford. I read English. I came out of Oxford. All of my friends went off to these incredibly high-paying jobs. And I was like, okay, fine, I want to work in television. How do I do that? Oops, nobody in my family knows anybody who works in television. And that usually is one of the routes. So I went on a typing course. And I just remember, I've still got the files, actually. I made myself a promise that every single day that I wasn't working in television, I would write to somebody in television. In those days, they were letters rather than emails or WhatsApps or Snapchat, whatever it is. But I literally wrote a letter every single day to someone in the media just to say, not please can you give me a job, but please may I ask your advice? How did you get to where you got to? How would you suggest?
Because people quite like that.
People like talking about themselves, don't they? So not me, but anyway, I have to say I do find it a bit uncomfortable talking about myself, but anyway, we'll keep going. So anyway, I wrote to one person every single day, and then once I'd exhausted all of that, I then rewrote to everybody who hadn't replied to me, and I just said, please can I ask your advice? And then when I was there, I'd say, who would you suggest I ask next? And that slowly built up a small network of people that I'd been in touch with, and then eventually somebody suggested that I go, you mentioned Sacha Baron Cohen, for a screen test.
Well, how did that happen?
That was my first, I'd been a secretary in the BBC, so I'd been a secretary for Esther Ranson and Ruby Wax, and I'd basically the typing pool, I was just put in lots of different offices, which was also brilliant because it gave me a chance to see how different programmes were made. And then they put me in front of a screen with Sasha before he was, a mega god. And we ended up doing a program together every single day called F2F, where we got into all sorts of scrapes because
Did that stand for something?
Face to face.
Okay.
Yeah, probably something else in Sasha's world. But it was wonderful working with him.
Just the two of you?
So face to face, yes. It was just the two of us, and I was essentially Sasha's stooge, and nobody knew what he was getting up to every single day. And there was one particular day where he had one of his supposed friends come in called Kenny Slide. And Kenny Slide was this DJ was going to tell everybody how to act. By the way, there is a live studio audience of children. Anyway, throughout this interview, Kenny decides that he's leaving the city and the cool life of London, and he's going to go and live to be, it's a naturist, isn't it, when you live without clothes rather than a naturalist? Which one is it?
Naturist.
Yeah. So he was going to be a naturist. So throughout this interview, Kenny, I'm realising, is starting to remove an item of clothing of every single question that we ask him, to the point where he is absolutely naked in a studio full of children, and all these children are going absolutely crazy. An inexperienced director in our ears, screaming and shouting, not knowing what to do. And so Sasha obviously thought this was... No pants on. This boy was completely naked in front of... Can you imagine these days if that were to happen? And so I had a computer, and so the one of the cameras cut to my computer, and I got up some fictitious website while everybody was removed from the studio. Sasha, as you can imagine, well, the next day we were both called in. I had no part in organising all of this, but Sasha was suspended. And I think that's when he was kept on full pay. This was through LWT. He was kept on full pay, and I think they knew that they had an absolute superstar on their hands, but they didn't know how to, mould him. And while he was on full pay, being suspended, he came up with Ali G, and that was the beginning of Sasha's enormous, incredible career with me as his stooge.
The rest, they say, is history. I was just thinking there, though, with that Kenny Slide. It's great training then for the BBFC.
Yes,
what was
full circle.
What was appropriate?
Lots of nakedness.
Okay, so it's quite a long then step to news. Where does that happen?
So I know, bizarrely, the next screen test I had was for Meridian. So I ended up going down to Southampton.
Meridian, long gone and long lamented. One of the ITV,
exactly,
the ITV Southern franchise.
Yes, exactly. So I went down there, and I was woefully, inexperienced to be their main news anchor at the evening slot, regional news. But instead, they trained me up to do the morning opt-outs on what is now
whatever
the
it was
morning
then,
show.
I
think it was GMTV in those days. Anyway, so that's where it started, and then very soon I was moved from the morning slot back to the job that I'd applied to that wasn't appropriate for at the time. Did evening news with Fred Dinage. Do you remember how?
Of course.
The wonderful, genuine legend that is Fred Dinage. And then from Fred, I moved to London Tonight, London Today with Alistair Stewart.
You came to London then,
all very quickly. Everything was in kind of like half-year chunks, because I just felt like I was so lucky at that time. All the doors just kept on opening.
Were you pinching yourself?
I couldn't believe it, really, because it's all I ever wanted. I really knew that I wanted to work in news at that point, and I was just very lucky that the opportunities just kept on coming. And it was when I was at London Today and London Tonight, I was asked to go and work at Sky, and I was just like, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to work at Sky. And my agent at the time was insistent that I did, to get the experience of working in live news and in a news environment. So I worked at Sky for about a year and a half. And then I remember getting an email from Roger Mosey, the absolute legend of news, Roger Mosey, and he said to me, I just need to get my ducks in a row, but would you be interested in BBC Breakfast? And that obviously was just dreamy. And little did I know that one of the ducks that he was getting in a row was you.
Well, surely, no, hold on. Surely you said, well, who would my co-presenter be?
Well, of course.
Said, this is the clincher. No. Yeah.
But I don't know if you know, Dermot, but years before, I had a friend who'd gone to the RTS, and I was so in awe of you that I had actually asked him to get me your autograph.
Oh, no. So what did I say?
So for me,
tell her to go away
on the sofa next to you was just a dream come true. I was just absolutely thrilled to bits to be poached from Sky and to be sitting next to you. And I promise you, I don't know how you feel. Well, you're going to have to tell me this now, but
who's interviewing who?
Exactly.
Go
That's
on.
part of the problem. That was, I think, one of the best jobs I've ever had, was sitting on that sofa next to you. I loved it.
Back at you. I mean, we'll talk in some detail about that in a moment or two. But one point I want to say, I mean, you're very young then. You're breaking into news and, you're streaking through the firmament. But then, and a little bit now, you always seem to be paired with older men. I mean, I am older than you, but perhaps a little less so than some of the others. And let's not name specific names. But did you find from the executives, perhaps from some of your co-anchors, that, there was even unconsciously a hierarchy, that you were the junior partner?
That's really interesting. I've never really thought about it like that, but you're absolutely right. Apart from Sasha, who was roughly equivalent to me, a few years older, I've always been paired with a slightly old man. And I don't know, I think it's just about chemistry. I'm sure you feel the same, that some relationships really work on screen and some really don't. And for me, yes, you're right. It's always been an older man. Never noticed that before. Do I feel like there's been a hierarchy? On occasions, absolutely. There have been a few presenters, on-screen husbands, that I haven't, even if there's been an age difference, I haven't felt like there's been a hierarchy. But definitely there have been relationships where I've been told there's a hierarchy. And
you were told that explicitly.
Well, I was. And you know what? I was fairly green in those days, and I was also extremely respectful of my co-presenters for reason that they were much more experienced than I was. It wasn't because it was a man, but I would have had respect for that co-presenter, whether it had been a man or a woman, if they'd been in the industry longer than I had, and it just so happened that they had.
But didn't you, I mean, on occasion, didn't you find you talked about, that it was fed back to you that there is a hierarchy? I mean,
definitely.
Was it actually formalised at any point?
I mean, there was one particular contract that I had to sign, and again, with no names, where I had to sign a contract. And can you imagine if this happened these days, where I was always going to speak second, and that my male co-presenter always had to have the first bong, the first headline, and the top bit of the story, even if the story was, divided up. And that was a contract that, I was very, at that point, I felt very lucky to have that job. I wasn't going to be pushing back. But these days, if that happened, could you imagine? It just would absolutely not be acceptable.
Well, it's not that very long ago, though, is it? I mean, it's just amazing how quickly perceptions change.
Yeah.
So, okay, we get to breakfast in 2002.
Is that when it was?
As I remember, yes, quite a long time ago. And I find myself sitting beside you on the sofa. I mean, it was just a mad time. I mean, crazy early as well in terms of getting up. And I always admired, I got to say this to you, your attention, your research, because I must say, I mean, the hours killed me. I would be like a little less than diligent in reading.
Let me reflect on that, if you don't mind.
You get these briefs, don't you? Background on your guests and what's coming up, and of course read the papers. After a few months, I just thought, look, it's hard enough waking up and pouring some coffee down my throat. I'll just sit on the sofa and see what Natasha says, and I'll follow her.
Out the bag. I worked so hard in those days, and I have to say, with all the different roles I've had since, that was the most stimulating job I've ever had, because it had everything. We were setting the news agenda. There was, politicians to pop stars that sat next to us. It was based in London in those days, so the Prime Minister would pop in or whatever. We had the most amazing guests and a huge team to support us. And I would always get the briefs the night before, and I remember you would just literally rock up at the last minute, and it was just like, you didn't even have to put any makeup on. You just like walked out of amazing Louis, our gorgeous driver, Louis's car, and Louis would have already dropped me like 2 hours before, and I would be diligently writing out all my questions, and you just like stroll in and just sit down and just start like you hadn't even woken up. I always felt safe next to you, though, Dermot.
Not entirely
no, but if there was, I'm sure you did lots of research, but you were far more confident, perhaps, and capable than I was in those days.
That is entirely untrue. You mentioned the Prime Minister, of course, was Tony Blair at the time, during our entire time on BBC Breakfast, and he did just pop in, didn't he? Because it was so fair and he was so relaxed. But it struck me then, and it still strikes me now, in terms of, the hundreds, probably thousands of politicians and others that we've both interviewed, just how extraordinarily adept he was at manipulating the media, but seeming to engage. Did that not come across to you?
I think he had a very smart team around him, didn't he? And he was riding a wave, and I guess we were part of that. The media that were potentially being manipulated. I don't know. We probably gave him the airtime that he needed to be manipulated, if that's what you think.
But it was that addressing a different audience.
Yeah, I think things have changed so much now. I think everyone's become so much more savvy, and I think the way that people consume news now is so different. Those were like the set piece of the day, weren't they? An interview like that. Whereas now they're popping up on all sorts of podcasts and
well, you don't need to be interviewed, do you? You make your own video,
and then immediately you're out there. I think days of news were different then. Feel like we were very lucky.
We'll take a short break there. This podcast is brought to you by Big Motoring World, one of the UK's biggest used car supermarkets. Their mantra is we're big on what matters to you. And they're big on choice, service and value. They price check their cars every day to give a best price guarantee, with up to 95% of cars priced below market value. Search bigmotoringworld.co.uk to find your nearest store and for terms and conditions. Talk to me about the fun times, because there were so many. Yeah, the hours weren't great, but, just on that sofa before we expand into your wonderful career at the BBC. But, some of there were a lot of bloopers. Do you remember an interview with Bill Oddie in a cow buyer?
Oh, and didn't the cow wee on him or something like that? I can't remember. What was it? Was that what happened?
He bought a whole... and I think you or me said yes, it brings a whole new meaning to the term golden shower, as he was standing there because the cows were elevated and one lifts its tail, and Bill Oddie, he just took it in his stride, literally.
I always remember I don't know if you remember this, but there was a story once, and sometimes these stories on a slow news day, they used to come round again and again and again, and when you'd got over this one blooper, I just felt like we just kept on doing it throughout the morning. But it was a story about macadamia nuts on the Limpopo River. Okay, it didn't land with you, but with me, it still scarred my soul. And it was the way that it came up on autocue, and it just the one word just seemed to go on forever. And every time it came up, I just giggled so much. But we did have so much fun, and it was such a lovely team. And I just, as I said a moment ago, I felt very safe with you. There aren't always those relationships on air where I kind of felt like you knew when I was stressed, or if something had happened that I wasn't happy with, or I just felt like we picked up each other where the other one was weaker.
Well, quite literally. Maybe you don't, I forgot about the macadamia nuts. I think you may have forgotten about probably due to my perhaps not reading the briefs. It was leading up to, I think it was the 2004 presidential elections. And we had a story before that, I thought, about the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority and, some
and it was State of the Union address
tweaks in
night.
Their rules. And yes, this bloke sits down, I'm ready, I was first. And I go, so what do you think about this change in the rules for the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority? And he goes, well, I don't know, I can see both sides of it. So, well, you've tweaked it, you've changed it. Surely you have an opinion one way or the other. And you gently tapped me on the leg. Damn it. He's the London correspondent of the Washington Post. Yes. He's here to talk about George Bush
doing the State of the Union address overnight. But I don't know if you know this, or if you remember even, but the floor manager who put the wrong guest in the wrong seat never came back. I think it was a really big moment, actually. It was a big mistake.
Thank you for pointing that out. I should have stayed quiet.
No, because I always tell that story as well as one of those moments where you just turn and give just the wrong question to the wrong person. And that was a very uncomfortable moment. But yes, the State of the Union address to fertilisation didn't quite roll, did it?
No, I think it was, yes.
But it was amazing coming off air, after 3.25 hours or whatever it was. And then suddenly, we had the day free and everybody else was, turning up for work. And frequently I would end up then going off and doing some crazy job in the evening as well, a corporate or an awards ceremony, and then take my pillow overnight and be in Manchester at 11 o'clock at night and then sleep in the car and go straight into work. It was an amazing time.
Well, quite shortly into that role, a couple of years into it, you went and used your so-called downtime after the show to go and trip the light fantastic, as you were one of the inaugural participants and ultimately the winner of this strange thing that everyone's going, what is it called? Strictly Come Dancing? Imagine. And I just thought, well, I remember Come Dancing, this rather stiff formal show on about 11 o'clock in the evening. Surely you can't be doing that. Oh, no, they're revamping it. And I just remember thinking, why are you doing it? I think you thought that too, didn't you?
Not just a bit. I mean, I fought against that so much, being part of that show. But I think because I was relatively new to the BBC, I think they just needed a lineup. You know, they needed to make it a successful show, and they identified that they needed a newsreader. I was the newest newsreader, I think, on the team, and therefore I think I was in their sights. I tried so hard not to do that programme. And again, I don't know if you remember, after I resisted it for so long that we'd come off air, and I'd quite often go into my dressing room, and my dressing room would be full of the outfits that they were expecting me to wear on Strictly Come Dancing in a way to entice me to do the show. And it was just like, you have no idea, that's just making me more determined not to do a dancing show in a small curtain with a bit of fringing. Forget it. Absolutely not. But I did succumb in the end, as you know, and it was a strange time. Now I think people who do Strictly, they know that they need to clear their diaries. You know, it was a brand new show. I was getting up at 3:20 every morning. I don't remember what time you were getting up, but I was at work at 4. Yeah, exactly, 10 to 6. I was at work at 4. You see, it's all coming out. I was at work at 4. You rolled up at 6. And then I was dancing all day and then falling into bed at 8 o'clock at night, you know, absolutely exhausted, and doing the same thing the next day. Because when they came to me originally about Strictly, they said, oh, it's only going to be, 2-hour lessons a week. You know, I'm sorry, when there are 12 million people watching you on a Saturday night, 4 hours of dancing doesn't cut it. So it was an amazing time. I kind of look back on it now and I really wish that I'd enjoyed it more. But at that time I was feeling, relatively insecure as a female newsreader, new on the block, didn't want to, still want to be taken seriously, but then in these tiny outfits, what was that going to do to my career? Maybe taking myself a bit too seriously, but I felt like it was a big risk. I felt like it was a big risk.
And nobody knew at the time what a huge, behemoth it would become. You had no idea.
No, absolutely no idea what a huge success. And people talk about that Strictly bubble. And then I came out of it, the winner, like kind of mortified that I'd won, and all the way through kept on saying, please don't vote for me, I've got a holiday halfway through. I had this holiday that I wanted to go on with my girlfriend. I didn't want to let her down, and I think everyone thought it was a strategy, but anyway, I did win it by mistake.
I remember being in the front row at one of your performances, wonderful, with my then little girls and now big girls now, were absolutely bedazzled, and you came over to them and they're going, jaws on the floor, just before you danced,
but
and,
I don't know if you
and said hello to them. Then you'd said, whatever you do, don't vote for me.
Yeah, exactly. Don't vote for me. I really meant it. But I don't know if you remember, after Strictly, the newsroom, I remember my post bag just suddenly burst with all these letters from, little children who'd been mesmerised by the show, but also much older people who fell in love on the dance floor. And the bouquets of flowers that arrived in the newsroom from dance schools that suddenly had this influx of people that wanted to dance. And I think it was at that point that people thought, okay, fine, maybe we have got a hit on our hands, this show that's touched every part of, the viewership, as it were. It was an extraordinary time. There were lots of negative things that happened as a consequence of that, but lots of doors opened as well.
Do you think, just on the standards, just very quickly, do you think you would have won it now?
I think we know, Dermot, that I would not have won it now.
I think
we know that I might not have even got past week 1. The standards now are unbelievable. But again, then, in slightly self-defense, people didn't know what a foxtrot looked like. So there was also, you probably still don't, but people, were being educated about dance on that show as well at the beginning. This is what a rumba looks like. This is what a cha-cha feels like. This is the kind of music that you would expect when you have a particular dance. I think the country's come a long way in understanding what that particular dance needs to show. So I think, it was the beginning of a big journey.
You did just touch on there, did open other doors and not welcome ones. You suddenly become, if you weren't before, you certainly were then, tabloid fodder.
I was.
This show took the nation by the scruff of the neck, and there you were, leading it and ultimately winning it and becoming fair game.
Yes.
I mean, in their estimation.
But that, again, it came as a shock because it wasn't necessarily something that I'd sought. I remember sitting next to you with the newspapers, and we had to review the newspapers in those days together, and just kind of dreading opening the newspapers to see who I'd been out with that weekend. And, you know, there was one weekend where I think I'd been out with Tony Benn and like 4 other men, supposedly. And I was suddenly tabloid fodder, not very comfortably.
Tony Benn.
Oh, but I was actually really good friends with him. He actually was one of the men. No, he was one of the men I'd been out with. I adored Tony. But there were lots of other, you know, there was a lot of stuff about me, which some of it was true and a lot of it wasn't. And it's only years later that I found out that my phone was being hacked at the time. And I'm absolutely sure that my phone, I would not have been of interest to the tabloids if I hadn't have done Strictly. So when I say Strictly was wonderful because it opened lots of doors, which we can talk about, it also opened, as I said, the unwelcome door of becoming, interesting in that way. And it was only probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little less, that I found out that my phone was hacked during that whole time. And that was really hard to reflect
without
again.
Going into too much detail. Is that settled? I mean, have you resolved that?
I was very reluctant. I was actually very reluctant to get involved in it again, because it just felt like all of that, I had to relive it again. But I had the most amazing team. I wanted an apology. I didn't particularly want any money from it, although I did get some. I really wanted an apology for what happened. And I think I was part of the test case with Elizabeth Hurley, the first 8 people that went through. And I did get my apology, but it still, it changed a big course of my life at that period.
But one of the welcome dimensions, as you touched on it again there, was that it did turbocharge your career at the BBC. They took you away from me, 6 o'clock news, where you worked with wonderful, late lamented George Alagai, God rest his soul. And of course I think you were the youngest ever presenter of the 10 o'clock news. I mean, filling in. But wow. How did that feel?
Oh, it felt, well, I was very sad to leave you, genuinely. But I was finding the mornings really difficult. After a while, it really eats into your life, doesn't it? And I was very ambivalent because I was always in a rush. And I always say this to people now. I feel like it's my job to remind people, when you're in a really amazing job that you love, even if you're ambitious, don't forget to really enjoy every single day. And I was in a rush to get off that sofa, to move on to the next thing. But actually, I look back at that time, that was the most interesting job, quite genuinely. And I always say this, that I ever had, because it was so diverse. And reading the 6 o'clock news with George, who I absolutely adored, was an amazing, honour. But it wasn't stimulating in the way that Breakfast was, because it was, the further you get down the news agenda, as you well know, the more resources are poured into the day, and also the shorter the bulletin, the less chance to have a bit more personality.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's back to reading out loud, isn't it? Which is, and you spend hours finessing a script, and you think, I could ad-lib this. If I was on a rolling channel or on Breakfast, I wouldn't. Who cares whether there's a comma there or an and or a but? But if you've got the time and you're preparing one of these tailored bulletins, you spend hours agonising
over each sentence, and then you work together as a group, don't you? You know what that feels like. So, it was a test in a different way. But I missed all the kind of live interviews and the diverse group of people that we had the chance to meet.
It did open other doors for you as well. I mean, one of the most memorable, and again, it's a long-running series. Who do you think you are? I mean, I watched that and I watched you on that. I mean, very, very different, obviously, from Strictly or Breakfast or anything. This was right at the core of who you are and who your antecedents were as Natasha Kaplinsky.
It was an extraordinary experience. I remember after Breakfast one day meeting the team from Who Do You Think You Are in the canteen at the BBC, and they said, look, what do you know about your family? And I told them, and they said, okay, would you mind if we just go away for a few weeks just to do a little bit of research, and then we'll come back to you if you're of any interest. 3 days later, I get a phone call saying, we would really like to follow your story. And having just been involved in, a reality TV program kind of, that Strictly was, I felt that this was a really different kind of reality. And so I obviously spoke to wider members of my family, not just my close family. And it was decided that it would be, a huge gift to the family to pursue the story, mainly of my father's side rather than my mum. And that was amazing. They took away my passport. They gave me some money to get some winter clothes. So I didn't really know where I was going, and was told to pack for a warm environment as well and to meet them at the airport. And when I've watched that program, I've always looked at it thinking, oh, it's choreographed. They've done it 5 times already, but actually it really isn't. And for me, this story just unfolded. We went to South Africa, which of course I knew, just discovered a little bit more about what a hero my father was, and that was amazing. And then I was taken to Belarus. I'd always thought that my family my father's side of the family were from Lithuania. And it was just such a brutal experience. I mean, it was really very, very painful. I was following this photograph of these 2 absolutely beautiful girls with big bows in their hair. And I needed to find out what had happened to them. And of course, we know what happens. Everybody dies, and the Nazis killed everybody in a huge amount of my family. And when you're doing the filming for Who Do You Think You Are, you know that you have to cry once, because that's kind of what happens. But it was like, oh my gosh, is this the day? And then it was just every single day. It was just relentless brutality, and it was really, really, really hard.
And the village was still there in part, and some of the buildings were there.
So we went to one of the synagogues where my father's ancestors used to go. Not the synagogue that a number of them were burned alive in, but a synagogue. And it was just so charged, that whole experience. And I remember the end of the filming of that. I just said, they said, oh, you're not allowed to tell your family what's happened. And I'm just like, I'm so sorry. This is a reality that I'm not going to share with the public. I'm not going to wait to tell my father what happened to his family. I'm going to speak to him as soon as I get home. And they said, well, you've signed a contract here. You have to do this in front of the camera. And I just said, fine, then this is the end of this. I can't be involved in that. That's just a step too far. And actually, we ended up doing a different kind of ending, which was much more positive, because you have to end on a happy note.
But your father didn't know either.
My father knew obviously some of it, but not all of it.
And so it was really,
it was just so heartbreaking, wasn't it? It was so heartbreaking. But again, talking about doors opening, Who Do You Think You Are? Many years later, I was in the kitchen, received various emails which I thought were, spam, and deleted immediately, but they kept on coming back from Downing Street. And that was when David Cameron eventually opened one of them. David Cameron was setting up a Holocaust Commission, and it was an invitation to be a Holocaust Commissioner. And that obviously was because of the experience of Who Do You Think You Are? So that's kind of opened up a huge
When you opened the email, you didn't have to be asked twice.
No. Then I went in and was asked to be a commissioner, which was a huge honour. For a year, there was a group of us that were sent around the world to see how countries mark the Holocaust, because in this country we have not done it well enough. A year later, we presented a report. Everything in the report was accepted. One of the recommendations was that a learning centre and memorial needs to be built, which we're still going through planning permission. How many years later? That was in 2014.
Just beside the Houses of Parliament.
In Victoria Tower Gardens. So I'm still on the board, still do lots of work for that board. And then the other thing was that Holocaust survivors their stories had not been recorded in the UK. Being the only journalist on the board at that time, I said, okay, fine, let me do some interviews from some Holocaust survivors of their stories, survivors who'd never spoken before. And so we started off with 5 survivors. And in the end, it was just such an extraordinary experience that I kind of stepped out. At that point, I'd moved on to ITN, stepped out of the newsroom, and by that stage, I'd been married and I'd got children, and ended up interviewing 112 Holocaust survivors who'd never spoken before. And my voice always changes when I speak about these survivors, because they entrusted me with their stories, which were just so horrific. And, most of them had got to a point in their life where they knew that they didn't have very much longer to live. They'd kept the secret of the Holocaust from their families in order to protect their families. And then suddenly the theme seemed to be that they needed to share what they'd been through. in order that, one, the families understood their backgrounds, but also that, the Holocaust anything like the Holocaust wouldn't ever happen again. So that took about 15 months. And I'll be truthful to say that I think I nearly had a breakdown at that point because I was so relentless. It was like I was settling a family score because of the who do you think you are? And I was just putting myself through so much trauma just to try and get these stories out. And each interview took so much research. Each interview was, 5 or 6 hours long. These people were at the ends of their lives. A lot of them have died since the interview. And then it was also all their families who then were having this kind of big reveal about what had happened in their loved ones' lives. It was such a privilege. The chief rabbi at the time said it was a sacred task. And it really felt like a sacred task. It was a huge honour, but it really seared me.
I can hear it in your voice now, Natasha. I mean, but what a service to history. What an archive. As you say, so many of those people no longer with us. And certainly, they'll all be gone fairly soon, unfortunately. But, would you say listening to that, would you say it's your finest body of work, whatever else you've done anywhere? This is a legacy, for history, an archive that, that fights anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial.
Absolutely. And hatred in all of its forms. Possibly, yes, Dermot. As I said, I felt like I was settling a family score, but I was given, somehow I just had this absolute determination that this was something I had to do. And, along the way, there were so many people that just said, Natasha, you need to stop. You need some therapy. You've changed. You can't stop crying. It really was. But I keep saying, Dermot, it was such a privilege to meet these people and to hear their stories and to try and create this archive that eventually will be in the Learning Centre when it eventually gets built. Yeah. My sadness is at the end of every interview, I promised each and every one of those survivors that, they had gone through the pain of the interview for good service, that, we would be able to share those interviews. But, we still haven't been able to find a proper home for them. But the work of, the Holocaust Commission and the boards that I'm on, still exists. So possibly that was, I guess the body of the interviews, yes, they probably are the best thing I'd have done as a journalist. The best is the wrong word, isn't it? No, the lasting legacy, the most important. And as I said, I just feel so humbled to have had that opportunity and that they trusted me with their stories.
Mm-hmm. Just in terms of what we're discussing, you talk about the boards that you're on, plural and multiple plurals. Let's put that there for a minute, and there's a bit more of your formal employed news career, because after the BBC, you became the £1 million newsreader at 5 News, Channel 5. Yeah. They poached you, and you were again plastered across the newspapers as this £1 million poaching.
I know, and that was another extraordinary episode in my career. And what was really difficult at the time was I was newly married and I was having multiple miscarriages, and I was absolutely desperate to have a family. And I was working on the 6 o'clock news, and I'll never forget, there was one day where, again, this was because my phone was being hacked, picking up the phone, a little bit like you, I'd caught the bug of getting into the studio at the last minute. And George and I would always kind of leave it till like 3 minutes before 6 to go in and then do the bongs live. And I answered the phone on the news desk. And, hello, is this Natasha Kaplinsky? Yes, it is. I just want to say how sorry I am to hear that you've just lost your baby. And it was a woman, and I still can't ever forgive a woman. I can't forgive anybody to do that ever, actually. But for a woman to do that to another woman, my hormones were raging all over the place. I'd been off work because I'd had another miscarriage, and I just was so traumatized that somebody would do that to me just before I went on air. And my tears just kind of went over the news desk. They didn't just fall down. I was so hurt and so upset anyway that I'd lost another baby. And I had to go in and do this news bulletin. I couldn't believe that someone would do that.
Indeed, how they knew.
Now we know how they knew, because my phone was being hacked. But obviously at the time I was shouting at the clinic, how dare you release my medical information, but anyway. And it was, I think, probably that experience that just made me think, I've got to get myself sorted. So I had to come off work anyway, because I needed a big operation. I'm happily, I've got 2 children now, and I'm so grateful for that. But I needed a big operation, so I needed some space from work. And at the same time, I was poached from Channel 5.
By Channel
5. And it was really bizarre, because I think it was written up like, I'd gone for the money, but actually I'd gone because I desperately wanted to have...
I've got to, being the good journalist I am, was it $1 million?
It was a lot of money, and it was $1 million. It was just ridiculous. I mean, it was just for
reading out loud.
It was also saying goodbye to the BBC. That was a big decision, and I think they needed to do something to move me. But actually, it wasn't for the money. It was I needed the mental headspace. I desperately wanted a family. But what was incredibly awkward was, by the time I arrived at Channel 5, I'd had my operation, and I'd unbelievably got pregnant again straight away. I started Channel 5 with billboards up and down the country, the face of news on motorways and all the rest of it. And I was pregnant, and I just didn't know what to do, because I needed to tell them that before I'd even started this job, I was pregnant, and it was the most important thing for me. And I just felt so guilty.
Oh, Natasha.
But I couldn't tell anybody, obviously.
Woman gets pregnant.
I know. But, nobody knew the backstory about the multiple miscarriages and why I'd needed to leave the BBC and the operation and all the rest of it. But at the time, I again, and then one day I looked out of my window and there were 16 photographers outside. I was just like, how did that happen? Who knew that I was pregnant? Again, it must be the clinic. But actually it was the phone hacking. And then I had to break the news to Channel 5 that their new girl was actually not going to be able to stay for very long. For them, they got all the publicity, and then they didn't have to pay me, because, as a freelancer, you don't get paid if you don't rock up to work.
There was a quid pro quo. You mentioned that, their new girl who was they were putting all over buses and etc. on billboards. They wanted an image change as well. They wanted more of strictly sparkly Natasha than I think the straight, sober, and serious.
News with personality was the strap line, and I think they wanted viewing figures to change, and they did significantly. So it was a success. At least I gave them something.
But were you resistant at all to the image change? To their wearing jeans, perching on desks, whatever it was.
Channel 5 are very good at that, aren't they? They did it with Kirsty before me, and then she stood up when she read the news, and that was big wow. And then it was wearing jeans.
Legs,
Woman has personality shock. But it was a change. But for me, that was a really, I felt so blessed to then have a pregnancy that held, and a child. And Arlo came along, and then very soon after Arlo came Angelica, who refuses to be announced by that name these days. Her name is Kika. Okay. So Angelica and Kika. Arlo and Kika.
And you mention your family, and you can talk as much or as little as you want about this, but because, within your own life, we report on, the most awful disasters. I remember, covering the tsunami with you, Madrid bombings live on air. Nothing of that magnitude happened to you, but it did. A proper disaster, an explosion on board a boat you were on in the Ionian Sea, and you were all, big fireball, and you all end up in the ocean.
So that was really hard. And again, that's where my voice changes, because, that's one of those moments in life where you live or you die, and we were just unbelievably lucky. But we were on holiday. The children were 8 and 9, and we were on a boat, and there was, the boat stopped working, and there was a phone call about, what do we do? And then the ignition was turned one more time, and there was only 6 of us on board. So it was 3 generations of my family, my parents, myself and my husband, and the 2 children. And just the configuration of where we were sitting, I was sitting at the back of the boat with my father and Kika, and there was the boat just blew up, basically. It was just like James Bond, and it was just this enormous explosion, and Kika and and we were right on top of it. And so we were very, very, very badly, well, I mean, it was just horrendous. So we were in the water for a long time. You know, it was a huge blast, and then the boat caught fire. But by that stage, we were all in the water. My father doesn't swim, so luckily he had a life jacket on, and we were in the water. We telephoned to shore at that point to find out what to do about the boat. So the man on the shoreline had heard the explosion and heard us all, screaming. And so there were boats just looking for us everywhere. And we were in the water for about 45 minutes, I think, before we were found, which turns out to be a real blessing because Kika and myself had our faces burnt very badly, but the seawater, because there was water on our faces constantly, that's what soothed us. Anyway, we were eventually, I start shaking even thinking about it. We were taken to shore and taken to different hospitals, which was also really, really hard because she needed paediatrics. And I didn't see her for a long time. And then I didn't see anything for a long time because my face had swollen so much I couldn't open my eyes. And then eventually we were airlifted back to the UK. And very luckily, where we live in Sussex is very close to the Burns unit at East Grinstead. And so many people came to suddenly, I know this person who knows that person. And we were just really taken care of as a community. And the kindness of strangers, it taught me huge lessons in life, that people who you don't even know will reach out and support you. And at the end of our drive, gifts were left constant. Obviously it was out of the newspapers for a long time. But as you said, it did become a news story, which was very uncomfortable because Angelica and I we took all the mirrors off the walls because we looked so freakish, and we just stayed at home for a long time, just kind of massaging her face with lots of oils and growing. We had a race to grow back our eyelashes and our hair. But yeah, then news journalists started turning up, and we've got 2 gates. And I remember one of them got through the first gate and then got stuck between the first and the second gate. And I just, I thought, it serves you right. And that was from the Sun newspaper. It's like, that's not nice. Yeah, that serves you right.
How much, because it obviously did, how much did it change then, that incident, your worldview? You talk about the struggle to have a family. Here you have a family and then they're critically endangered. And how much did it change your perspective on what is and isn't important in life?
It was funny. I felt like it was an absolutely horrendous experience. At the time when we were in the water, I remember thinking, this has come to me for a reason. This is a lesson in life. I don't know what it is yet. I didn't think we were going to die, but I knew that it was the turning point. And it was really, the gratitude that I have for having such a precious family, for having my children, and the kindness of strangers. It was a turning point. I felt like I'd done a lot in my career already. It wasn't a moment where I thought I want to step back, but it was a moment where you just realised how life can change in a second and how grateful you have to be every single day because you don't know what's happening tomorrow.
And now you devote most of your professional time, I guess. I mean, I know you're obviously still involved in television and you've done quite a lot of news since the 5 years as well. Of course you have, particularly with ITN. But it is your devotion to other people, the kindness of you as a stranger to them. And you do it through, just such extensive charity work. And, I know it's not anything you want to so-called boast about or anything, of course not. But you do a lot, don't you? I
do, and that's a huge privilege, and that I guess takes me back to the beginning of the story about being daughter of a refugee and a psychotherapist, and being brought up in Kenya and realising how lucky we are to live in this country. I've worked for Save the Children for over 20 years. President of Barnardo's, a lot of work with Holocaust education. And the problem is every charity that I get involved in, I keep saying, please don't suck me in, don't suck me in. Okay, yes, I will. Because I just love people. I love the opportunity to be able to help in any way that I can. I feel like we have been given a voice as journalists to try to help. And in any way that I can use mine, I try to.
Would you, is news now behind you? I mean, if let's say the editor of BBC Breakfast called you up and said, I've just been listening to this, let's have you back for a bit. I mean, I know the current team, and there's been many since we left, absolutely fantastic. But say, come on, Natasha, come and do a few shifts, would you?
I would have one proviso. It would have to be next to you, Dermot. I would only do it with you.
No.
I feel
if they moved it 12 hours,
yes.
Yeah,
exactly. If we could pre-record it at night. I feel like... careers have stages, don't they? I feel like that was a really amazing, privileged stage of my life. I feel like I have moved on quite a bit since then. But journalism is still a huge part of my life. I still, my problem is the children, whenever I meet anybody, stop interviewing everybody. It's like, I'm not interviewing them. I'm just interested. I'm really interested in people. I love meeting new people. I love hearing people's stories. And I don't think that ever leaves you as a journalist.
And can you be journalistic about those stages in life? I mean, I know it is life is very different to categories, but you mentioned those categories. I mean, are there some broad stages? I
feel like there was, the media stage, which also had the charity woven through it all the way through. Of course it did. And in fact, going back to Strictly, I was so against doing Strictly. And then I was at the time, I also was patron of a charity called Merlin, which was the British equivalent of Médecins Sans Frontières. And I was on a trip to the Congo when I was trying to make up my mind about Strictly Come Dancing. And at that point, I suddenly realised that if I did do Strictly and used it not as a profile building exercise for myself, but if I gave my fee to Merlin, then I would feel happy doing it. And so that's why I eventually did Strictly, because I felt like I could talk about Merlin and give my money to that. I mean, not that I ended up talking about Merlin very much in those days. There wasn't the opportunity because everyone was still, talking about glitter balls. But that's what I think that, I gave my fee to a charity then. And it's just, I don't know. So there was the media stage. Then I guess there was the family and the charity stage with a bit of media thrown in. And now I've got these wonderful roles at the BBFC, and I'm chair of the Royal Ballet School, which is
a dance link there. I mean, does that come from Strictly, or did you always love ballet?
I've always loved ballet. I've always just loved ballet, and that's been a really amazing experience recently, working with a fantastic team and working at the Royal Ballet School with these unbelievably privileged young people, that are just so dedicated.
But you say privileged, but they don't have to be privileged to get in there,
no,
do
not
they?
at all.
It's
90% of the students are on bursaries, and I think that's one thing that we do need to communicate much more, that these are not, privileged children, but they have the most unbelievably privileged education. But the dedication of these students to the most wonderful elite art form is just so compelling. So I spend a lot of time there these days as well. Not dancing, although we've got a board meeting coming up, and I haven't yet told the rest of the board yet, but I'm going to insist that they take part in a ballet class, because I think it would be good for us all to get our ballet shoes on.
Are you going to do it?
Of course I am. I'm going to make them all do it.
Well, what about seeing the ballet? Presumably you get to see quite a lot of it as well.
I love the ballet.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I adore it. I spend a lot of time in dark places. So, obviously television studios, but also, the movie theatres and at the ballet school and at the Royal Opera House. Just amazing.
I must admit, I've never actually been. Do you think you could convert me? Because I've got prancing around in tutus with no words. I mean, what goes on?
I remember taking Kika, our daughter, to see her first ever ballet, and at the top of her voice, she just, "Mummy, when are they going to start talking?" It's like, well, they don't talk. That's the whole point. Have you never been to a ballet, Dermot? No. You are going to be my guest.
Okay, right. Okay.
I'll see if I can persuade you. You'll love it.
And then that's cinema. Yeah. I mean, the first time, let's end where we started with the BBFC. I mean, so many people still call it the British Board of Film Censorship, don't they? It's weird. It's not. Of course it's not. But I mean, the first time I realised I obviously wasn't paying attention, Mr. News, was I was sitting in the cinema a couple of years back, 2-3 years back, and I thought, does that say Natasha Kaplinsky? What the hell? How did you get that?
What a wonderful, privileged job that is. That was, I think it was kind of an amalgamation of all the work that I do in terms of child protection. So Barnardo's as president, Save the Children and various other children's charities. It is essentially an organisation that, as I said earlier, that protects children from seeing things that they shouldn't see. And there's a lot of work still to do there. So obviously there's the glamorous side of things, but there's a lot of political lobbying that goes with that role as well. We've just been involved in a porn review because there's not offline online parity. So children can access things online, as we know, that they would not normally be able to see. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this country to continue that child protection theme. So that came through the work that I'd been doing already. But again, lots of interviews for that job. That was probably the first job ever, actually. In fact, it was that I had to apply for and have a CV, because every other role had come to me. I'd been given these roles that I'd had and been so lucky. And then suddenly it was like, well, could you send me a CV? It's like, I haven't got a CV. I've never applied for a job before. But I did apply for that job and I was so desperate to get it. I'm so thrilled to have it. I think I'm the first female president. And we classify, we reorganize the classification by boundaries every 4 years. And so that
reflects
what we did.
What? Changing social mores?
Yes, exactly. Small changes in social attitudes. So we relaunched the guidelines last year. So we've got another couple of years of these guidelines. And what was interesting was seeing how views have actually got more conservative rather than less. You'd expect things to loosen up, but actually, parents and young adults have decided that actually they don't like to watch, swearing as much as they used to. And they just tiny marginal changes, but they're all reflected in the guidelines.
Well, what an asset you are to that organisation and all the other ones you devote your time to. Tell you what, though, if you do want to get back to news and BBC Breakfast, let's give them a ring. Get us back on the sofa. You can bring Bill Oddie and the cow.
Oh, my word. Well, I've actually got my own cow these days. I've got a Highland cow called Mabel and 47 other animals, including 6 dogs. So as long as they can all come along, Dermot, we can have a lovely morning breakfast together.
Legend. Natasha Kaplinsky, thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you, legend Dermot.